If someone told you that in a room full of billion-dollar power, a single sentence could erase a person from existence, you would not believe it. But in Manhattan, inside one of the most exclusive restaurants overlooking Central Park, William Carter proved that invisibility was not a metaphor, it was a decision. The kind of decision made with a glance, a dismissive tone, and a belief that some people simply did not belong in the same frame as him. The dining room was wrapped in quiet luxury, crystal glasses reflecting soft amber light, the scent of roasted herbs and aged steak drifting through air that cost more than most apartments in the city. At the center of it all sat William Carter, a billionaire CEO known for turning startups into empires and people into afterthoughts. Across the room moved Aaliyah Johnson, a waitress whose presence was so understated that most guests forgot she was there the moment she left their table. But she noticed everything. The way conversations paused when she approached. The way eyes slid past her instead of meeting hers. The way silence followed her like a rule she had never agreed to. William Carter did not look at her when he spoke about her. He simply leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks as if the subject did not require his full attention, and said she was invisible, as though it were a fact as natural as gravity. No one corrected him. No one laughed. No one disagreed. That was the kind of room it was. A room where agreement was safer than truth. Aaliyah paused near the edge of the table holding a tray steady in her hands, her expression calm, controlled, unreadable. She had learned long ago that reaction was currency, and she never spent it cheaply. William continued speaking about a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, his voice carrying the ease of someone used to being obeyed without question. Around him, investors nodded, not because they necessarily agreed, but because disagreement was expensive. Aaliyah placed a glass down gently, the sound barely audible, and for a brief moment William's gaze passed over her without landing, as if she were part of the furniture, as if she existed only in function, not identity. It was not cruelty that defined the moment, but indifference so complete it became its own form of power. And yet, something in that indifference would not hold. Because invisibility, when applied long enough, begins to gather weight. And weight, when it reaches a breaking point, does not remain unseen. It shifts. It pulls. It changes the geometry of the room without asking for permission. That night, Aaliyah Johnson did not speak louder. She did not demand attention. She did something far more dangerous in a place like this. She remained exactly where she was and waited. Inside the calm precision of that dining room, conversations continued as though nothing unusual had occurred, yet the air had subtly shifted in ways most people could not name. William Carter spoke about expansion plans and market dominance with the ease of someone who had never been told no in a room like this, his voice steady, practiced, and absolute. Around him, executives leaned in at the right moments, laughing at the right pauses, agreeing at the right times, not because they were inspired, but because they understood the cost of not aligning with him. Aaliyah Johnson moved through the space with quiet discipline, refilling glasses and adjusting plates with the kind of efficiency that made her almost disappear into the rhythm of service itself. And yet, she was not absent. She was observing. The way decisions were made without consulting anyone outside the inner circle. The way names were spoken with weight or dismissed without effort. The way William Carter never once needed to raise his voice to command a room that already belonged to him. At one point, as she passed behind his chair, she heard him say something that seemed less like a statement and more like a philosophy, that people were either relevant or they were not, and relevance was determined by usefulness, not sentiment. No one challenged him. No one even paused. Aaliyah placed a water glass down beside an investor who immediately looked past her toward William as if she had never existed in the interaction at all, and for a brief moment, she understood the structure of this world not as a place of dialogue, but as a hierarchy of attention. In another corner of the room, a discussion began about a major acquisition, numbers floating through the air like currency without weight, hundreds of millions spoken about as casually as restaurant orders. William leaned forward slightly, his presence tightening the space around him, and the room followed his lead without hesitation. Aaliyah noticed how even disagreement seemed carefully packaged here, softened before it could become dangerous. She had seen many rooms like this before, but something about this evening felt more deliberate, as if every silence had been trained to respond to him. When she returned to the service station, she allowed herself a brief moment of stillness, not exhaustion, but calculation. She was not unaware of what she represented to them, or rather what they believed she represented. It was not anger that settled in her thoughts, but clarity, a quiet recognition that invisibility was not absence, but permission granted by others to ignore what they chose not to value. Across the room, William Carter continued speaking, unaware that the structure he trusted so completely was not as stable as it appeared. Because rooms like this did not collapse loudly. They shifted first in perception, then in attention, and only afterward in consequence. And tonight, attention was beginning to move in ways he had not yet noticed. The conversation at the table continued to flow like polished glass over stone, smooth on the surface, yet carrying weight underneath that few people bothered to acknowledge. William Carter shifted slightly in his seat as the discussion around him deepened into financial projections and acquisition timelines, his voice occasionally cutting through with precise direction, shaping decisions before they were fully formed. He had a way of speaking that made certainty feel like the only reasonable outcome, and everyone around him adjusted themselves accordingly without hesitation. Aaliyah Johnson moved through the edge of that world with controlled precision, her presence still unacknowledged in the way she had long since learned to expect, yet her awareness sharper with every passing minute. She noticed patterns most people ignored, how attention always bent toward William before he even spoke, how silence in his presence was not emptiness but agreement waiting to happen, how even hesitation in others seemed to resolve itself in his favor before it had time to become visible. As she approached the table again, she overheard fragments of a deal being finalized, numbers spoken with casual confidence, references to expansion across multiple cities in the United States, as though entire markets could be moved like pieces on a board. One of the executives leaned in, asking a question that was not truly a question, but a confirmation seeking permission to exist, and William responded without looking up, his tone steady, stating that efficiency required clarity and clarity required removal of distraction. The word lingered in Aaliyah's mind longer than the sentence itself. Distraction. She understood exactly what that word meant in rooms like this. It did not refer to chaos or noise. It referred to anything that did not reinforce the center of power. She placed a fresh glass near the edge of the table, her movements measured and silent, and for the briefest moment, she felt the weight of being reduced to function rather than presence. Not anger, not frustration, but a quiet recognition that invisibility in this space was not an accident, it was structure. Across from her, William Carter continued speaking about performance metrics and long-term strategy, his confidence unbroken, his assumptions unchallenged. Yet something subtle was beginning to shift in the behavior of those around him. A slight delay before agreement, a fraction of hesitation before laughter, a moment of attention that did not immediately return to him. It was small, almost imperceptible, but in environments built on control, even the smallest deviation carried meaning. Aaliyah stepped back from the table, her gaze briefly lifting across the room, not toward him, but beyond him, as if seeing the structure of the space itself rather than the people inside it. And in that moment, while the room continued to orbit around William Carter's certainty, a different kind of alignment was quietly forming, one that did not yet announce itself, but was no longer willing to remain invisible. The room continued to operate under the illusion of stability, yet beneath the polished surface of glassware and quiet conversation, something had begun to recalibrate itself. William Carter remained the fixed point, the center of gravity for every voice at the table. But even fixed points can become unstable when the space around them begins to change. He leaned slightly forward as another executive presented updated figures, his expression unchanged, his attention appearing absolute. Yet there was a subtle delay now in how quickly others responded to him, as if the room itself was beginning to test whether his presence still required immediate alignment. Aaliyah Johnson moved along the perimeter of the dining area with the same controlled precision. But her awareness had deepened into something sharper, not reactive but observational, as if she was no longer simply within the room, but reading its structure. She noticed how laughter no longer arrived at the exact moment it was expected, how agreement now carried the faintest hesitation before becoming spoken, how even the rhythm of conversation had begun to loosen at the edges. William Carter, however, seemed unaffected, continuing to speak about projected growth and operational efficiency, his voice steady and deliberate, reinforcing the narrative that control was not something he held, but something that naturally belonged to him. Yet the absence of challenge does not always mean acceptance, and silence, when stretched too long, begins to change its meaning. Aaliyah paused near a service station, briefly adjusting a set of glasses, and in that moment she observed something subtle shift across the table. One of the executives, mid-sentence, corrected himself before finishing a point, not because he was wrong, but because he had reconsidered whether agreement was still the safest form of participation. That hesitation was small, almost invisible, but it marked a fracture in the pattern. William Carter did not acknowledge it. He did not need to. His world had always reinforced itself without effort, like architecture designed to withstand questioning. But architecture can weaken without collapsing, and what begins as imperceptible tension can eventually redefine the structure entirely. Aaliyah lifted her gaze briefly across the room again, not toward him, but toward the network of people who had built their positions around his certainty. For the first time, she did not see them as individuals responding to a leader, but as parts of a system that required constant reinforcement to remain intact. And systems, she understood, do not fail in moments of crisis. They fail in moments of doubt. William Carter continued speaking, unaware that the space around him was no longer responding with the same immediacy it once had. And in that widening gap between expectation and reaction, something fundamental had already begun to shift, not loudly, not visibly, but irreversibly. The shift in the room was still subtle, almost invisible to anyone who was not trained to notice the weight of hesitation in human behavior, yet it was becoming more difficult to ignore with each passing minute. William Carter remained composed at the center of the dining table, his presence still commanding the structure of the conversation, but the rhythm around him was no longer perfectly synchronized. A question from one of the senior executives landed slightly differently than intended, followed by a brief pause that lingered just a fraction longer than necessary before William responded, his voice steady, but now carrying an undercurrent of measured correction. He did not appear concerned. If anything, he seemed to interpret the moment as natural friction within a system he believed he fully understood. Aaliyah Johnson continued her movement through the space with quiet precision, but her attention was no longer only observational. It had become analytical, as if she was mapping the invisible dependencies that held the room together. She noticed how every agreement still ultimately returned to William, but the path it took to reach him had begun to change, less direct, less immediate, more conditional. One of the investors glanced toward another before responding to William's statement, a small gesture that would have been meaningless in isolation, but, within this environment, suggested the early stages of recalibration. William Carter spoke about long-term expansion into new metropolitan markets, referencing projected growth across multiple cities in the United States, including New York and Chicago, as though the trajectory of the business world was already an extension of his own planning. His confidence remained intact, yet confidence alone does not prevent structure from shifting beneath it. Aaliyah paused briefly near the service corridor, her hands steady, her posture unchanged, but her perception sharpened by the accumulation of small inconsistencies. She understood now that what she was witnessing was not disruption, but transition, the moment when systems begin to test whether authority is still automatic or if it must now be reinforced. At the table, William made a subtle gesture with his hand, expecting immediate alignment, and for a moment it came, but the speed of response was no longer identical across the group. That difference, imperceptible to most, was enough to register as change. No one questioned him directly, and no one openly resisted, but the emotional tempo of the room had begun to loosen, like a tightly controlled mechanism that no longer responded with perfect precision. Aaliyah placed another glass quietly on the table, the sound nearly non-existent, yet in her mind it marked something distinct, not an action, but a signal. William Carter continued speaking, unaware that the architecture of attention surrounding him was no longer fully stable, and in the widening space between expectation and response, the first true signs of imbalance had already begun to form. The atmosphere inside the dining room had settled into a strange duality, where outward composure remained intact while the internal rhythm of the space continued to drift further from its original precision. William Carter still held the conversational center, his voice measured and controlled as he elaborated on future acquisitions and projected performance across multiple sectors within the United States market. Yet the responses he received were no longer immediate reflections of his intent. They were still agreement, still alignment, but now accompanied by micro delays that subtly altered their meaning. Aaliyah Johnson continued her movement along the outer edge of the room, maintaining the same professional discipline that had allowed her to remain unnoticed, but her awareness had become increasingly attuned to the behavioral structure unfolding before her. She observed how attention itself was no longer automatically anchored to William, but instead briefly tested alternative points of focus before returning. That hesitation, however brief, was no longer isolated. It was repeating. One executive adjusted his posture before responding. Another paused mid-sentence, as if reconsidering phrasing, and a third glanced briefly toward a colleague before affirming agreement. None of these actions were explicit challenges, yet collectively they indicated a shift in dependency, as though the room was quietly recalibrating its reference point for authority. William Carter did not acknowledge these changes directly. His confidence remained structurally intact, and he continued to speak as though nothing fundamental had altered, reinforcing his position through volume of certainty rather than reaction to environment. He referenced operational scalability and market expansion across major urban centers, including strategic positioning in cities such as Chicago and Los Angeles, maintaining the tone of inevitability that had defined his presence from the beginning of the evening. Yet inevitability requires continuous validation, and validation was beginning to slow. Aaliyah paused near the service station, her hands steady as she adjusted a set of glasses, her expression unchanged, but her internal recognition sharpened. She understood now that what was unfolding was not disruption in the conventional sense, but a redistribution of attention. In environments like this, attention was not passive. It was currency, and currency, once diversified, no longer belonged exclusively to a single source. At the table, William made a brief concluding gesture as he finished a point, expecting immediate affirmation, and although affirmation came, it arrived with less uniformity than before. That lack of synchronization, barely perceptible to most, marked a fundamental deviation from established pattern. Aaliyah lifted her gaze momentarily across the room, not toward William, but toward the network of individuals who had constructed their roles around his certainty. For the first time, she did not see a stable hierarchy. She saw a system in transition, still functioning, still intact on the surface, but no longer operating with unquestioned cohesion. And within that transition, something irreversible had already begun to form beneath the silence. The dining room had entered a state that no one inside it could fully name, yet everyone was beginning to feel. William Carter still occupied the center of attention, his voice steady as he continued outlining strategic expansion plans and long-range financial projections across multiple United States markets. But the room no longer responded to him with perfect immediacy. There was still agreement, still acknowledgement, but it now carried a texture that had not been present earlier in the evening, a slight delay that suggested thought before response rather than instinctive alignment. Aaliyah Johnson moved quietly along the service boundary of the room, her presence still formally invisible to most of the guests, yet her perception of the environment had become increasingly precise. She noticed how attention, once fixed and predictable, was now subtly shifting in small increments, no longer returning to William Carter with absolute certainty, but instead passing briefly through alternative points of focus before settling back into place. That brief hesitation was not overt enough to be considered disruption, but it was consistent enough to be recognized as change. William continued speaking without interruption, maintaining the same controlled cadence that had defined him from the beginning of the evening, reinforcing authority through clarity and certainty rather than reaction. He referenced operational consolidation and market dominance strategies across several major metropolitan regions in the United States, including New York and Chicago, framing each statement as an extension of inevitable growth. Yet inevitability, when no longer immediately reinforced by response, begins to lose its invisible strength. At the table, One executive paused slightly longer than necessary before affirming agreement, while another adjusted his phrasing mid-sentence as though recalibrating tone in real time. These were not acts of defiance, nor even conscious hesitation, but they were deviations from pattern, and deviation in structured environments always carries meaning. Aaliyah placed a glass carefully at the edge of the table, her movement precise and unhurried. And for a brief moment, she observed the collective rhythm of the room as if it were no longer fixed to a single center. William Carter made a small concluding gesture with his hand, expecting the familiar synchronization of acknowledgement, and although it arrived, it was no longer perfectly unified in timing or form. That lack of synchronization passed almost unnoticed by most individuals present, yet it marked a structural change in how authority was being processed within the space. Aaliyah's gaze lifted briefly across the room once more, not toward William directly, but toward the interconnected field of people whose responses had once been immediate and uniform. What she saw now was not collapse, but redistribution, a subtle reordering of attention that had not yet declared itself openly, but was no longer reversible in silence. And in that quiet redistribution, the center of gravity within the room had already begun to shift without permission or announcement. The change in the room was no longer theoretical. It had become measurable in the smallest human behaviors that most people failed to notice when power was assumed to be stable. William Carter remained at the center of the dining table, continuing to articulate his vision for expansion across key United States markets with the same disciplined confidence that had carried him through every previous negotiation. His voice was steady, deliberate, and unchanged in tone, but the responses around him were no longer perfectly synchronized with his expectations. Where there had once been immediate affirmation, there were now brief pauses that stretched just long enough to suggest independent consideration before agreement. Aaliyah Johnson remained positioned along the outer service path, her movements consistent and controlled, but her awareness had shifted into a deeper observational state. She no longer saw the room as a static hierarchy. She saw it as a living system recalibrating itself in real time. At one point, William made a precise statement about projected returns and operational scaling across multiple metropolitan hubs, and the executives around him responded appropriately, but not uniformly. One nodded almost immediately, another followed after a noticeable delay, and a third looked briefly toward a colleague before committing to agreement. None of these actions would have been significant in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that suggested something subtle had changed in how authority was being received. William Carter did not acknowledge the shift. He continued speaking as though the structure remained intact, reinforcing his position through uninterrupted certainty rather than reaction to the environment. Yet, even certainty requires reinforcement from external response, and that reinforcement was beginning to arrive with less immediacy. Aaliyah placed another glass near the table edge, her expression neutral, her presence still largely ignored in the formal sense, but her perception of the system had become increasingly clear. She recognized that attention, once fully centralized, had begun to distribute itself across multiple points within the room. It was not rebellion, nor disruption, but reallocation. And reallocation, once begun, does not require permission to continue. William concluded a point with a slight downward gesture of his hand, expecting the familiar rhythm of immediate consensus to return, and although agreement followed, it was no longer uniform in timing or intensity. The delay between thought and response had grown just enough to be noticeable to someone who understood patterns rather than isolated moments. Aaliyah's gaze lifted briefly across the room, not toward William directly, but toward the collective behavior of those who had once functioned as extensions of his certainty. What she observed now was not collapse, but differentiation. Each individual was still participating, still engaged, still aligned in outcome, but no longer identical in reaction. And in systems built on unchallenged centrality, even slight differentiation marks the beginning of structural change that cannot be reversed by repetition alone. William Carter continued speaking, unaware that the space around him was no longer responding as a single unified reflection of his presence. And in that widening gap between expectation and execution, the foundation of control had already begun to shift in ways that silence alone could no longer conceal. The room had reached a state where silence itself felt different, no longer passive but increasingly interpretive, as though every pause now carried potential meaning. William Carter continued to occupy the central axis of the dining experience, his voice steady and authoritative as he expanded on projected outcomes across multiple United States markets, including detailed references to urban growth strategies and enterprise scaling models. Yet the responses he received were no longer immediate reflections of his certainty. They still arrived, still affirmed, but the timing had subtly fractured into variations that were no longer uniform. Aaliyah Johnson remained positioned along the outer service boundary, her movements controlled and unbroken, but her attention had shifted into a deeper structural awareness. She no longer observed individual actions as isolated events. She observed relationships between reactions, delays, and the invisible timing that once made authority feel absolute. At the table, William concluded another segment of his presentation with a measured pause, expecting the familiar return of synchronized acknowledgement. The responses came, but not as a single wave. One executive nodded immediately, another followed after a brief delay, and a third adjusted his posture before agreeing, as if recalculating alignment in real time. These differences were small, almost negligible to an untrained observer, yet in environments built on precision of influence. Even slight deviations begin to accumulate weight. Aaliyah placed a glass at the far edge of the table, her hand steady, her expression unchanged, yet her perception of the system had fully transformed. What she now saw was not disorder, but segmentation. The once unified field of attention surrounding William Carter had begun to separate into individual points of consideration, each still connected to him, but no longer fully governed by automatic response. William Carter did not acknowledge any change. He continued speaking with the same controlled confidence, reinforcing structure through certainty rather than reaction, but certainty, without immediate reflection, begins to function differently over time. It becomes assertion rather than dominance. At one moment, he made a precise reference to projected financial expansion across key metropolitan regions within the United States, and although the group responded appropriately, there was a perceptible layering in their reactions, as if each individual was now processing his statements through slightly different internal thresholds before returning agreement. Aaliyah's awareness sharpened further as she recognized the significance of this deviation. In environments like this, authority is not only measured by speech, but by the speed at which speech becomes accepted reality. And that speed was no longer consistent. William Carter adjusted his posture slightly as he continued, unaware that the structure supporting his presence within the room was no longer operating with perfect cohesion. The system had not broken. It had simply begun to differentiate. And in that differentiation, the first irreversible stage of transformation had already taken hold beneath the surface of silence. The shift inside the room had reached a stage where it was no longer about isolated hesitation, but about accumulated perception, subtle enough to remain unspoken yet consistent enough to alter behavior. William Carter remained at the center of the dining table, continuing to articulate his strategic vision with controlled precision, referencing multi-market expansion across major United States metropolitan areas, including structured projections for revenue scaling and operational integration. His voice maintained its steady cadence, the kind that had historically produced immediate alignment without question. Yet the responses surrounding him were no longer identical in form or timing. They still affirmed his statements, still followed his direction, but the rhythm of agreement had fractured into variations that were increasingly difficult to ignore if one was attentive to structure rather than content. Aaliyah Johnson remained positioned along the outer service boundary, her presence still formally unacknowledged in the hierarchy of the room, yet her perception had shifted into full systemic awareness. She was no longer tracking individual interactions. She was tracking synchronization. And synchronization, once disrupted even slightly, begins to reveal the architecture beneath it. At the table, William completed another segment of his strategic outline, his hand making a precise downward motion to signal conclusion, expecting immediate and unified affirmation to follow. The affirmation did come, but not as a single coordinated response. One executive nodded immediately, another followed a moment later, and a third adjusted his posture before agreeing verbally, as if recalibrating his position relative to the group rather than responding directly to him. These differences remained subtle, but they were no longer isolated. They were repeating. Aaliyah placed a glass at the edge of the table with controlled precision, her movement unremarkable to anyone not actively observing her. Yet her awareness now extended beyond surface behavior into structural timing. She recognized that authority in this environment was not only expressed through speech, but reinforced through immediacy of response. And immediacy was no longer consistent. William continued speaking without acknowledgement of any shift, reinforcing his position through continuity rather than reaction, referencing projected dominance across multiple urban financial corridors within the United States, including long-term positioning in high-value metropolitan centers. His confidence remained unchanged, but confidence alone does not stabilize a system when feedback begins to alter. At one moment, he paused briefly after making a definitive statement, and although agreement followed, the delay preceding it had extended slightly beyond what was previously normal. That extension, almost imperceptible, carried more significance than any verbal response in the room. Aaliyah's gaze moved briefly across the space, not toward William directly, but toward the pattern of those responding to him. What she now observed was not resistance, nor disruption, but redistribution of interpretive weight. Each individual was still aligned in outcome, but no longer unified in immediacy. And in systems built on assumed centrality, even minor redistribution of response timing begins to reshape the definition of control. William Carter remained unaware that the structure supporting his influence was no longer operating as a single synchronized mechanism, and in that widening gap between expectation and execution, the system had already begun to transition into a state that no longer required his permission to evolve. The atmosphere inside the dining room had entered a phase where silence was no longer neutral, but increasingly loaded with interpretation, as if every pause between words had begun to carry measurable weight. William Carter remained positioned at the center of the table, continuing his structured articulation of long-term enterprise strategy across multiple United States metropolitan markets, including detailed references to expansion cycles, operational consolidation, and projected financial scaling. His tone remained unchanged, steady and deliberate, reinforcing a sense of authority that had historically required no validation beyond its own delivery. Yet the responses he received were no longer identical in rhythm or immediacy. They still aligned with his statements, still confirmed his direction, but the timing of that alignment had begun to vary in subtle but consistent ways. Aaliyah Johnson stood along the outer service corridor, maintaining professional stillness, yet her internal perception of the environment had fully transitioned into structural awareness. She was no longer observing individual interactions as isolated events. She was observing the coherence of the system itself. At the table, William completed another segment of his strategic outline, concluding with a controlled pause that traditionally invited immediate and unified agreement. The agreement did arrive, but it was no longer simultaneous. One executive responded instantly, another followed after a brief hesitation, and a third adjusted his posture before verbalizing consent, as though independently verifying alignment rather than reflexively participating in it. These variations, while subtle, were no longer random. They were consistent enough to suggest a shift in the underlying behavioral rhythm of the room. Aaliyah placed a glass quietly at the edge of the table, her movement precise and unremarkable to any casual observer, yet her attention remained fixed on the evolving structure of response patterns. She recognized that authority in this environment was not only maintained through speech, but through the immediacy of its acceptance. And immediacy was no longer uniform. William Carter continued speaking without interruption, reinforcing his position through uninterrupted confidence, referencing projected dominance across multiple metropolitan economic centers within the United States, including long-term positioning strategies in high-value urban markets. His delivery remained composed, but the system around him was no longer reflecting his cadence with perfect fidelity. At one point, he concluded a statement and paused briefly, expecting the familiar synchronized acknowledgement that had defined the structure of the evening. The acknowledgement followed, yet the slight delay preceding it extended beyond its previous pattern, creating a perceptible gap between expectation and response. That gap, though small, represented a deviation from established behavioral consistency. Aaliyah's gaze moved across the room again, not toward William directly, but toward the collective behavior of those who were still responding to him. What she observed was not resistance, nor contradiction, but a gradual redistribution of interpretive timing. Each individual remained aligned in outcome, yet no longer unified in response structure. And in systems built upon assumed centrality, even minor deviations in synchronization begin to redefine the boundaries of control itself. William Carter remained unaware that the mechanism reinforcing his authority was no longer operating as a single cohesive system, and in that widening space between expectation and execution, the architecture of influence had already begun to transition into a form that no longer required his awareness to evolve. The dining room had reached a state where even silence felt structured, as though it was no longer the absence of sound, but a measurable participant in the unfolding dynamics of the room. William Carter remained at the center of the table, continuing to speak with unwavering precision about strategic positioning across United States metropolitan markets, including long-range projections for enterprise consolidation and sustained growth trajectories. His voice maintained its consistent authority, the kind that had historically required no external validation, only passive acceptance. Yet what surrounded that voice was no longer functioning with identical coherence. The responses he received were still aligned in outcome, but the timing of those responses had developed subtle irregularities that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore if one was observing beyond surface behavior. Aaliyah Johnson stood along the outer service boundary, maintaining her professional composure, yet her perception had fully transitioned into systemic interpretation. She was no longer tracking individual gestures or isolated reactions. She was tracking synchronization itself. At the table, William concluded another structured point in his ongoing presentation, allowing a brief pause that traditionally functioned as a signal for unified affirmation. The affirmation did arrive, but not as a single cohesive response. One executive nodded immediately, another followed after a brief delay, and a third adjusted his posture before verbally confirming agreement, as though independently verifying alignment rather than participating in collective reflex. These variations, while still subtle, were now consistent enough to indicate a shift in behavioral architecture rather than momentary hesitation. Aaliyah moved quietly through the service corridor, placing a glass with controlled precision, her actions still formally invisible within the hierarchy of attention, yet her awareness was fully engaged with the evolving structure of the room. She recognized that authority in this environment was not only expressed through speech, but maintained through immediacy of response. And immediacy, once fractured, begins to alter the perception of control itself. William Carter continued without interruption, reinforcing his position through sustained certainty, referencing projected expansion across multiple metropolitan economic zones within the United States, including strategic positioning in high-value urban centers. His delivery remained stable, yet the environment around him was no longer reflecting his cadence with perfect fidelity. At one point, he made a definitive statement and paused, expecting the familiar synchronized return of agreement. The agreement arrived, but the interval preceding it had extended beyond its previous pattern, creating a perceptible separation between assertion and acceptance. That separation, though minimal in duration, represented a structural deviation from the established rhythm of the room. Aaliyah's attention moved across the space once more, not toward William directly, but toward the collective behavior of those who were still responding to him. What she observed was not resistance, nor contradiction, but redistribution of response timing. Each individual remained aligned in outcome, yet no longer unified in immediacy. And in systems built upon assumed centrality, even minor redistribution of synchronization begins to redefine the boundaries of influence. William Carter remained unaware that the mechanism reinforcing his authority was no longer operating as a single cohesive system, and in that widening gap between expectation and execution, the foundation of control had already begun to transition into a state that no longer required his recognition to continue evolving. The room had reached a condition where silence no longer functioned as background but as structure, shaping the perception of every exchange taking place within it. William Carter remained seated at the center of the dining table, continuing his articulation of long-range enterprise strategy across major United States metropolitan regions, his voice steady and composed, carrying the same controlled authority that had defined his presence from the beginning of the evening. Yet the environment responding to him was no longer operating with unified immediacy. The responses still arrived, still aligned with his statements, but the timing of those responses had become increasingly differentiated, forming subtle variations that were now impossible to fully dismiss if one was observing the system rather than the surface. Aaliyah Johnson stood along the outer service boundary, maintaining professional stillness, but her awareness had reached full structural clarity. She was no longer interpreting individual actions. She was interpreting coherence itself. At the table, William concluded another segment of his ongoing strategic outline, pausing with the expectation of immediate and synchronized affirmation. The affirmation did occur, but not as a singular unified response. One executive responded without delay, another followed after a brief pause, and a third adjusted his posture before confirming agreement verbally, as though independently verifying alignment rather than participating in automatic consensus. These differences, though still subtle in isolation, now formed a consistent pattern across multiple interactions. Aaliyah moved quietly along the service edge, placing a glass with controlled precision, her physical presence still formally unnoticed within the hierarchy of attention, yet her perception fully engaged with the underlying structure of the room. She understood now that authority in this environment was not sustained solely through speech, but through the immediacy and uniformity of response. And immediacy was no longer uniform. William Carter continued speaking without interruption, reinforcing his position through uninterrupted certainty, referencing projected expansion across multiple metropolitan economic zones within the United States, including long-term positioning in high-value commercial centers. His delivery remained stable, yet the system around him was no longer reflecting his cadence with identical precision. At one point, he completed a definitive statement and paused, expecting the familiar synchronized return of agreement. The agreement arrived, but the temporal spacing preceding it had extended beyond its prior consistency, creating a measurable separation between assertion and acceptance. That separation, though minimal in duration, represented a structural deviation in the behavioral rhythm of the room. Aaliyah's gaze moved across the space once more, not toward William directly, but toward the collective pattern of those still responding to him. What she observed was no longer resistance or contradiction, but redistribution of response timing across multiple independent points. Each individual remained aligned in outcome, yet no longer unified in immediacy. And in systems built upon assumed centrality, even minor redistribution of synchronization begins to redefine the boundaries of influence itself. William Carter remained unaware that the mechanism reinforcing his authority was no longer operating as a single cohesive structure, and in that widening gap between expectation and execution, the architecture of control had already transitioned beyond the point where recognition was required for its transformation to continue.